Hello, I made two recent videos in which I did a countdown of my top 20 biblical archaeology discoveries. And this is really the third video because when I counted down from 10 to 1, I said that my number one archaeology discovery was the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that it was significant enough that I wanted to do an entire video just on that. So this video is on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let me share my screen. Okay, sorry for the interruption there. Uh, Number one archaeology discovery is the Dead Sea Scrolls. This particular picture, which is on the screen right now, is an image of the Great Isaiah Scroll, the most famous of the scrolls because it contains the entire book of Isaiah from chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 66, verse 24. So let me tell a little bit of a story. It was on November 27, 1947. And this was a significant date in history because the United Nations General Assembly was voting on the partition of Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. This was going to be unpopular with the Arabs, and it would lead to the first of the Israeli-Arab wars. So on this particular day, the director of the Biblical Archaeology Department at Hebrew University in Jerusalem was a man named Eliezer Suknik. And he had heard a story from his friend, the Latin Archbishop of Jerusalem, a Christian, that there was a uh, antiquities dealer in Bethlehem who had several very old scrolls which were in Hebrew, but the Latin Archbishop didn't read Hebrew, but he suggested to Suknik that he would be able to tell what the scrolls were. And so Suknik went to Bethlehem on this particular day. He disguised himself as a woman because it was dangerous to cross into an Arab-controlled area on that day. And he saw these three scrolls, and he describes his experience. He says, I looked at the scroll. He immediately knew that it was a far older Hebrew scroll than anything he had ever seen before. He said he opened the first one and read a few lines. It was written in beautiful biblical Hebrew, though the text was unfamiliar to him. Anyway, Suknik bought the scrolls for $324, I think, and took them back. The first scroll was a scroll called a Thanksgiving Scroll, and a second scroll was the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Those were two of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, it set off a little bit of a race between the archaeologists and the shepherds, because originally the scrolls had been found in a cave near the site that's called Qumran, near the Dead Sea. And the story goes that an Arab shepherd had lost a sheep that had wandered into a cave, and to try to chase it out or something, it was hard to get to the cave, so he threw a rock into the cave, perhaps expecting to hear a sheep bleat or something like that if it had gone there. But what he heard was the sound of breaking pottery. And so he went in and found broken pottery. And inside the ceramic jars were scrolls. In any case, over the next few years, there was a extensive effort to survey and discover everything that was in that area. There turned out to be 11 different scrolls in the area, 11 different caves. And this picture on the right is of cave 4, which has about 90% of all the scrolls are in cave 4. So some things about the Dead Sea Scrolls, it turned out they've discovered over 1,100 scrolls. Most are just fragments. The picture of the great Isaiah scroll, an extremely long scroll, very well preserved, is an exception. Most of them are pretty small and fragmented and have been all torn up. The scrolls were found in Qumran. near the Dead Sea. That was an Essene community. We didn't know anything at all about the Essenes except that there was a community that existed, a sect that existed in Israel. It was mentioned by Josephus, but we didn't know anything at all about them. But now, based on this, we know a great deal about them. Some of these scrolls were found in, there were a few other Judean desert locations. There was a few found at Masada and a few found at a cave called Nahal Hever. But anyway, they were all found in the Judean desert. And the great majority of them are in Qumran. The scrolls date from 250 BC, that's the very oldest, to 68 AD. And it was in 68 AD that the community was abandoned during the Jewish-Roman War at that time. So by saying that they date to 68 AD, that makes these, the scrolls which are biblical scrolls, that makes these scrolls nearly 1,000 years older than any other Hebrew biblical scroll we have, and several hundred years older than the oldest Greek translations of the Old Testament. The scrolls were saved in ceramic jars, and because they were put in ceramic jars into a cave in a climate which was very, very dry, they defied the normal pattern of scrolls which are on animal skins, which are biodegradable. Normally, they would not have lasted for 2,000 years, but the unique conditions allowed them to actually survive, though they're very, very fragile now. The scrolls were mostly in Hebrew. This was a very interesting fact because the idea had developed kind of more in Christian circles than in Jewish circles, but the idea had developed that Hebrew had become largely a dead language by the time of Christ and that they just spoke Aramaic. This is kind of falsified by the Dead Sea Scrolls since there was more Hebrew than anything else. Although some of the scrolls were also in Aramaic, some were in Greek, and some were in Nabatean. Types of scrolls. I said there was 1,100 scrolls. It kind of depends on how you count. And the number of scrolls which were books of the Bible are 223. Again, that depends a little bit on how you count, because along with direct books of the Bible, there's pseudo-biblical scrolls, which are kind of like books about books in the Bible, or sometimes even just sort of expanding on a book in the Bible. There were liturgical scrolls, which give laws of the Essene community there and how they're supposed to live. Things like apocalyptic scrolls, like I mentioned, the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And there were all sorts of other things. There was a treasure map, there's a copper scroll. People, I think, have looked for it. You won't find any great treasure. There are even some financial transactions and bills of sale. I think one of the best ways we can think of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's not something that's like a great mystical thing, but what it was like a library. And if you had perhaps in your home an extensive library and the world was destroyed and somebody found your own library 2,000 years later, what kind of books do you have? You know, some books would be good books and some books would be maybe religious books and others would not be. And some books would be, you know, you might not even be so proud to have them in your collection. But anyway, that's the same sort of thing that you have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's nothing especially mystical or holy about it. It's just these are the surviving books from this community which was destroyed. The biblical scrolls, you can learn a few things because all the books are represented that are in the Old Testament, except for First Chronicles, Nehemiah, and Esther. It is most probable at this time that First Chronicles and Second Chronicles might have been in one, but might have been in one scroll. We don't know. If so, then maybe First Chronicles really was there, but we just don't have that half of the scroll. Also, it's likely that Ezra and Nehemiah were combined into one scroll. So we do have Ezra, but just the Nehemiah half didn't survive. And we don't have an Esther scroll. It's probably just due to the fact that random chance, those were not the most popular books and they're not saved in the ones which we still have. The ones which show up most frequently among the Dead Sea Scrolls are Genesis, Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Isaiah. an interesting collection because those are also the 4 books which are quoted most frequently in the New Testament. There are no New Testament scrolls among the Dead Sea Scrolls. For one thing, you wouldn't really expect them if the community was just abandoned in 68 AD. That is very, very soon after the time of Christ. And it's not for sure that all the books of the New Testament were even written, much less for there be times for there to be copies made and taken to Qumran, which, as we said, was an Essene community and not a Christian community. So you wouldn't necessarily expect any New Testament scrolls. I should mention that there was a scroll identified as 7Q5. By the way, the Q for Qumran, 7 is the cave number, and 5 would be the 5th scroll found there, which has 11 letters, I think, identified. And some people have said that that is a Greek scroll of the book of Mark. But like I said, it's only got 11 letters. I looked at it. I don't think it's a very convincing argument. I wouldn't say that. And here is just a picture of the Shrine of the Book Museum, which is in Jerusalem at the Israel Museum. And it is set up to look like the top of one of the ceramic jars which were discovered. And digital copies of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, most of the Dead Sea Scrolls are preserved there in the Shrine of the Book. And you can look at digital copies of all the Dead Sea Scrolls at that website, which is shown there. So I wanted to talk just a little bit more about the biblical Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm going to do that not using a PowerPoint, but using a website. I worked on this website myself. I was not entirely happy with the fact that translations of the biblical Dead Sea Scrolls were not widely available on the internet. There is a book which has all the non-biblical Dead Sea Scrolls translated, and you can buy that one on Amazon.com or anything like that. But when it gets to the biblical ones, it just gives you the Bible verse references. So I kind of was interested in doing that myself. So I developed this website, which has translations of the biblical scrolls. And you can learn a few things from the type of translations. The way that I did this website is I used some color coding. If you can look at it here, this is scroll 1Q Isaiah. It is the great Isaiah scroll, and it has the entire book of Isaiah. You might notice as you look at it that there's a lot of green, and if the text is green, it indicates that the Hebrew words are the same as in the Bible that we're used to, except the spelling is different. And you look at that and there's a great deal of green. And that's because the spelling has been modernized by the time they got to this 1Q Isaiah scroll. And it is a fairly more modern kind of spelling than the older Hebrew spelling, which used less of what they call vowel letters. When you see red in a scroll like this, that indicates that that scroll has a difference between that and the Masoretic text, which is the main Hebrew text that we're used to and the text from which your Bible was translated. Now so this scroll would not be a scroll which quite matches the Masoretic text. But look at this scroll. This is scroll 1Q Isaiah B. It doesn't have quite the whole book, but if you look at the text of this one, it's black all the way, just almost all the way. And that would tend to indicate that everything in there matches, almost everything matches the Masoretic text that we're used to have today, which we have our Bible is translated from today. Even in the area of spelling, this word is green, so it is spelled a little bit different, but there's very little of that. This is an older spelling style than that scroll. And the very interesting thing about that is that it indicates that the scroll was more likely copied letter for letter from a scroll in an earlier age. And that actually tells us that the text which we're used to using in the Old Testament, which we have today, was more copied letter for letter from an earlier age than most of the scrolls that were present in Qumran. Although this scroll, we would call it a Proto-Masoretic text because it matches the text which we use today. About 25%, about a quarter of the scrolls at Qumran that are biblical scrolls would be Proto-Masoretic texts. This one is a scroll 4Q51 Samuel A, and I brought this one out because it is a scroll which it doesn't match the Masoretic text. It is an example of a scroll where you might see a fair amount of red there. This scroll, although it's in Hebrew, is a scroll which matches the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. One of the things which got me started on writing this, developing this website, was actually an argument over whether the Dead Sea Scrolls were more likely to match the Masoretic text or more likely to match the Septuagint. Somebody was arguing that they're more likely to match the Septuagint. That is not true. 5% or less of the scrolls at Qumran match the Septuagint. They're much more likely to match the Masoretic text. Nevertheless, there are a few which match the Septuagint, and this is one main example of it. Here's a scroll that has a couple of unique features of Exodus. It was written in the Paleo-Hebrew script. That's the script that they used before the exile into Babylon. It doesn't mean that the scroll is that old. It is really not, but the script was that old. And this particular script, this particular scroll matches neither the Masoretic text nor the Septuagint, but rather it matches the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritans kept their own copy of the first 5 books of the Bible, and it's honestly not considered to be quite as reliable as the Masoretic text or the Septuagint, but this is one of the texts which was preserved there at Qumran. And finally, there's one more that I wanted to I've got to find a way to get rid of this. Well, maybe I just shouldn't. I was going to show you one more scroll. I'll get to it like this, which was one of my favorite scrolls, not because it was especially like the books of the Bible, but just because it was so different. I thought it was just sort of fascinating. This is scroll 11Q5, the Great Psalm Scroll. And look at the type of stuff it has in here. It starts with Psalms 101, then 102, 103, 109, 118, and then goes back down to 104. And then 147, 105. So you see, this has a lot of Psalms in it, but the order is all mixed up. Also, it begins to show quite a lot of different wording. And I think my conclusion on this is that this is not really a biblical Psalm scroll. What it is instead is a song book. You know, the Psalms were really books, things that they sang. And so I don't think this was made any effort at all to make this a copy of the book of Psalms like we have in the Bible today. Many of the other Psalm scrolls do match the Bible like we've got it today in the order and the content, but this just has all sorts of different things. It goes through the Psalms of Ascent. I wanted to get down to something that I wanted to show you. Oh yeah. You see, eventually you get to some Psalms which we don't even have in the Bible, like this apocryphal Psalm 154. This is a psalm that they've decided to name Plea for Deliverance. Then some other biblical psalms, 139, 137. This is a psalm called Apostrophe to Zion that only appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So anyway, I thought it was a very interesting scroll. It's one of my favorites, but I don't want to leave you with the wrong idea because I'm majoring on the unusual. The main message that you can take from the Dead Sea Scrolls is that from a biblical standpoint, it looks like it indicates that our Bible was very reliably copied, even going all the way back to the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It goes back to the time of Christ and a little before, from a scroll like this, which matches the scrolls and the Bible which we have even today. And so that's one of the main messages that I would take from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I hope you have enjoyed that video on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I hope to come back with another one before too long. Thank you for watching.